The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel illuminated a room full of billionaires, aristocrats, and A-list celebrities, all of whom were busy mocking the orphan bride in the corner. She wore a discounted dress. They wore custom Chanel and dripping Cartier diamonds. They whispered about her tragic past, deliberately spilling champagne on her train just for a laugh. But their cruel smirks vanished in an absolute instant when the heavy oak doors flew open and a real-life princess stepped up to the microphone to reveal the bride's true bloodline. The bridal suite at the Pierre Hotel in New York City was a sprawling masterpiece of gilded mirrors, velvet chaise lounges, and panoramic views of Central Park. It was a room designed for joy, for champagne toasts, and for the nervous giggles of a bride surrounded by her lifelong friends and adoring mother. Yet, on the morning of her wedding, Clara Hayes sat in the center of the massive room entirely alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of Manhattan traffic and the ticking of a grand antique clock on the mantelpiece. Clara was marrying Nathaniel Harrington, the sole heir to the Harrington real estate empire, a family whose name was etched into the sides of skyscrapers and museum wings across the eastern seaboard. Nathaniel was kind, handsome, and fiercely protective of her, but he was also blissfully blind to the insidious cruelty of his mother, Eleanor Harrington, and his sister, Chloe. Nathaniel believed that his family had finally accepted Clara. Clara, however, knew the dark, humiliating truth. Growing up in the grueling foster care system of upstate New York, Clara had never known her parents. She had been abandoned at a fire station at just 3 days old, wrapped in a simple wool blanket, with nothing but a silver locket tucked into its folds. She had spent her life bouncing between indifferent group homes, fighting for every scrap of education and stability she could get. She had eventually clawed her way through college on a full scholarship, becoming a dedicated pediatric social worker. That was how she met Nathaniel, at a pediatric oncology fundraiser hosted by his family's philanthropic foundation. He had fallen for her genuine warmth and striking, unpretentious beauty. His family, however, had looked at her and seen nothing but a gold-digging stray. As Clara stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror, she adjusted the bodice of her wedding dress. It was a lovely, simple A-line gown she had purchased off the rack at a modest boutique. Eleanor Harrington had promised to arrange an appointment for Clara at Vera Wang, insisting it was a family tradition. But when the day arrived, Eleanor had mysteriously canceled, claiming the designer was overbooked and simply couldn't accommodate a bride with such vague stylistic preferences. It was a deliberate sabotage, the first of many. Suddenly, the heavy suite door swung open. Eleanor Harrington swept into the room, flanked by Chloe and a small army of makeup artists who were packing up their high-end Charlotte Tilbury kits. Eleanor wore a custom-tailored Dior suit in a shade of white that dangerously bordered on bridal. Her diamonds caught the morning light like shards of ice. "Well," Eleanor said, pausing in the doorway to look Clara up and down. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with absolute poison. "It certainly is adequate. I suppose a dress like that perfectly reflects your humble beginnings, Clara. It keeps expectations grounded." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you, Eleanor." The seamstress did a wonderful job taking it in. Chloe, sipping a mimosa from a crystal flute, scoffed. "It's so brave of you to wear synthetic organza to the Pierre. I genuinely admire your lack of self-awareness. Nathaniel's friends from Exeter and Yale are going to have a field day, but I suppose it gives the event a certain rustic charity gala charm." "Chloe, darling, be kind," Eleanor murmured, though her eyes danced with malicious delight. Clara doesn't know any better. When one doesn't have a mother to guide them through the nuances of high society, these little faux pas are to be expected. "Speaking of mothers, Clara, who exactly is walking you down the aisle?" "You never did give the wedding planner a definitive answer." The question was a calculated strike at Clara's deepest wound. "I'll be walking myself," Clara said softly, her voice wavering just a fraction. "I've walked alone my entire life. Today won't be any different." Eleanor offered a thin, pitying smile. "How terribly modern. And tragic. Do try not to look too somber, dear. We wouldn't want the society photographers from Vogue thinking Nathaniel is marrying an extra from a Dickens novel." With that, Eleanor and Chloe swept out of the room, leaving behind a cloud of expensive Chanel No. 5 and a suffocating sense of isolation. Clara gripped the edge of the vanity, taking deep, shuddering breaths. She reminded herself of Nathaniel. She reminded herself of the way he looked at her, the way he held her, the way he had promised they would build their own family, far away from the toxic judgment of his relatives. She loved him enough to endure this. But as she made her way down to the grand ballroom, escorted only by a sympathetic hotel concierge, the sheer scale of the Harrington wealth threatened to crush her. The hallways were lined with tens of thousands of imported white orchids arranged by celebrity designer Preston Bailey. The air was thick with the scent of luxury and old money. Clara felt like an imposter, a fragile glass doll walking into a den of velvet-draped vipers. She had no idea that the cruelty of the morning was merely a gentle prelude to the absolute humiliation Eleanor had planned for the reception. The ceremony had been a blur of flashing cameras and suffocating tension. As Clara had walked down the grand, mirrored aisle of the Pierre's ballroom alone, she could feel the collective gaze of 400 elite guests burning into her skin. There were no warm smiles from the groom's side, only raised eyebrows and whispered judgments hidden behind silk fans and programs. Nathaniel, waiting at the altar, had looked incredibly handsome, his eyes locked onto hers with absolute adoration. For a few brief minutes as they exchanged their vows, Clara had managed to tune out the world. But the illusion shattered the moment the reception doors opened. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland of excessive wealth. Baccarat crystal centerpieces towered over tables covered in hand-spun silver linen. Waiters in white tuxedos glided through the room, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage Dom Perignon. As Clara and Nathaniel made their entrance as husband and wife, polite, restrained applause rippled through the room. It was the kind of applause one might offer a polite child playing a slightly off-key piano recital. Almost immediately, Nathaniel was pulled away by his father to greet the governor of New York and a consortium of international tech billionaires. Left standing alone near the ice sculpture, Clara became easy prey. She decided to find her seat at the head table to catch her breath, but as she navigated the crowded room, she noticed something horrifying. Eleanor had manipulated the seating chart. Clara's small handful of guests, 3 fellow social workers, her favorite college professor, and her elderly former foster mother, Mrs. Higgins, had been placed at table 42. It was a cramped, unadorned table located literally right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, practically hidden behind a massive floral column. They were completely isolated from the rest of the party. Before Clara could march over and demand the staff move her friends, she was intercepted by a group of Eleanor's closest friends, led by the notoriously vicious socialite Penelope Dubois and wealthy investment banker Arthur Kensington. "Clara, dear," Penelope called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Congratulations. We were just discussing your unique dress. Arthur here was convinced it was vintage, but I told him, no, Arthur, true vintage has structure. Where on earth did you find it?" "It's from a boutique downtown," Clara said quietly, keeping her chin up. Arthur chuckled, swirling his scotch. "Fascinating. Nathaniel always did have a penchant for rescue projects. First the animal shelters, then the youth centers, and now, well, you." Clara's face burned. "Nathaniel and I met through our mutual charity work, yes." "Charity work," Penelope sighed dramatically. "How noble." Eleanor was absolutely devastated, you know. She had her heart set on Nathaniel marrying the DuPont girl. Real pedigree there, a documented lineage tracing back to the Mayflower, but I suppose every aristocratic family needs a bit of common blood to keep the gene pool robust. Tell me, do you even know your real last name? My name is Clara Hayes, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, but before the orphanage assigned that to you? What was it? Smith? Jones? Arthur pressed, stepping closer, his imposing frame meant to intimidate. It must be terrifying walking into a room like this, knowing you are entirely untethered. No history, no legacy, just a blank slate who managed to secure for a winning lottery ticket. Before Clara could formulate a response, the sharp clinking of a silver spoon against crystal echoed through the massive room. Eleanor Harrington was standing at the main microphone, a terrifyingly serene smile plastered on her face. If I could have everyone's attention, Eleanor announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It is time for the toasts. As the mother of the groom, I would like to say a few words about our unique addition to the family. The room fell into a hush. Nathaniel hurried back to Clara's side, wrapping a protective arm around her waist. He smiled at his mother, completely unaware of the trap she was setting. When Nathaniel first told me he was marrying Clara, I was admittedly speechless, Eleanor began, pacing the stage slowly. In our world, marriage is a merging of legacies. It is a union of histories. When I asked Clara about her family history, she informed me that she didn't have one. She grew up in state facilities. She has no ancestral home, no family crest, no parents to stand proudly beside her today. Nathaniel's smile faltered. Mother, that's enough, he warned, his voice low, but he was too far from the microphone to stop her. No, Nathaniel, it's a testament to her survival, Eleanor continued smoothly, weaponizing her tone. It is a beautiful, tragic little story. We are a family of extreme privilege. It is our duty to give back to the less fortunate. And Nathaniel, my sweet, generous boy, has always taken that duty very seriously. He has given a home to someone who never had one. Let us raise a glass to Clara. May she finally experience what it means to be part of a real family, even if she had to marry into it to get one. The toast was a master class in public humiliation. It disguised brutal insults as philanthropy. The elite guests raised their glasses, exchanging knowing, mocking glances. A smattering of condescending laughter echoed from Penelope Dubois' table. Clara felt the tears prickling the corners of her eyes. Her hands shook so violently she had to set her champagne flute down on a passing tray to avoid dropping it. The entire room was looking at her not as a bride, but as a pathetic charity case. She felt smaller than she ever had in the foster system. She turned to run, to hide in the restroom, when the heavy, brass-studded doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly burst open with a deafening crash. The heavy, brass-studded mahogany doors at the back of the Pierre's grand ballroom did not just open. They were violently thrust apart. The deafening crash echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system, instantly cutting off the smattering of cruel, condescending laughter that had followed Eleanor Harrington's toast. 4 large men, in impeccable, dark navy, Tom Ford suits, stepped into the room. They wore discreet earpieces and moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that screamed elite security. They fanned out, creating a wide, impenetrable perimeter near the entrance. The orchestra, which had been softly playing a Vivaldi concerto, ground to a halt. The clinking of baccarat crystal ceased. 400 of New York's wealthiest power brokers, old money aristocrats, and tech billionaires turned around in their seats, their faces caught in expressions of sheer bewilderment. Eleanor Harrington, still standing at the microphone on the stage, gripped the stand, her perfectly painted lips parting in outrage. Nobody disrupted a Harrington event. Nobody. Then, the true interloper appeared. Stepping through the threshold was Princess Beatrice of York, a prominent member of the British royal family, accompanied by a small, impossibly chic entourage. She was dressed in a tailored emerald green Emilia Wickstead coat dress, her posture radiating an effortless, centuries-old authority that made the surrounding billionaires suddenly look like common merchants. Beside her walked a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair, carrying a leather folio bearing the unmistakable gold-embossed crest of the British monarchy. It was Lord Frederick Alastair, a renowned genealogist and private solicitor to the Crown. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Penelope Dubois nearly dropped her vintage Dom Perignon, and Arthur Kensington's smug, intimidating posture evaporated as he nervously straightened his tie. The Harringtons were wealthy, but this was royalty. This was a bloodline that dictated global history. Princess Beatrice did not look at the governor of New York. She did not acknowledge the hedge fund managers or the real estate tycoons. Her piercing gaze swept over the sea of custom Chanel and Armani, cutting through the opulent room until her eyes landed directly on the pale, trembling bride standing near the ice sculpture. "Excuse me." Eleanor Harrington finally sputtered into the microphone, trying to recover her composure. She forced her signature, razor-thin society smile. "Your Royal Highness, we are profoundly honored by your presence, though a bit surprised. I am Eleanor Harrington, the mother of the groom. If you are here for the reception, we would be delighted to have a table prepared for you at the front." Princess Beatrice began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Lord Alastair followed closely behind. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. No one dared to breathe, let alone speak. "I am not here for the reception, Mrs. Harrington," Beatrice said, her voice clear, unbothered, and carrying perfectly across the silent room without the need for a microphone. "And I certainly have no desire to break bread with individuals who find amusement in mocking a bride on her wedding day. I am here on official family business." Eleanor's smile completely vanished, replaced by a mask of pale horror. "Family business? Your Highness, I assure you the Harringtons have no pending matters with the Crown." "I am not speaking to the Harringtons," the princess replied sharply, dismissing Eleanor with a mere flick of her gaze. She stepped up to Clara. Clara stood frozen, her hands still trembling from Eleanor's brutal toast. Nathaniel held on to her waist, looking completely bewildered by the sudden intrusion. He instinctively pulled Clara slightly behind him, adopting a protective stance. "Your Highness," Nathaniel said respectfully, bowing his head slightly, "how can we help you?" Beatrice offered Nathaniel a brief, approving nod before turning her full attention to Clara. The royal's expression softened completely. The severe, authoritative aura melted away, replaced by an overwhelming look of relief and profound sorrow. "You have absolutely no idea who you are, do you, my dear?" Beatrice asked softly. Clara swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Clara Hayes. I don't understand what is happening." "Clara Hayes was the name given to you by the state of New York 24 years ago," Lord Alastair spoke up, stepping forward and opening his leather folio. He pulled out a large, heavily sealed parchment and a high-resolution photograph. "But it is not your birth name. For over 2 decades, private investigators spanning 3 continents have been searching for the lost heir of the Grosvenor-Windsor lineage." The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of frantic, hushed whispers. The Grosvenor family, headed by Hugh Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster, was one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in the entire world. To be tied to them, and to the Windsors, meant possessing a pedigree that made the Harrington real estate empire look like a lemonade stand. "That is utterly impossible," Chloe Harrington blurted out from the head table, abandoning all decorum. "She was dropped off at a fire station in a cheap blanket. She's a nobody." Princess Beatrice turned slowly, pinning Chloe with a glare so cold it could have frozen the Hudson River. "I would advise you to hold your tongue, young lady, before you further embarrass yourself in front of your betters." Beatrice turned back to Clara and gently reached out, pointing to the delicate silver locket resting against Clara's collarbone. It was the only piece of jewelry Clara wore, the only artifact she possessed from the day she was abandoned. "May I?" Beatrice asked gently. Clara nodded numbly. The princess carefully opened the locket. Inside, the metal was stamped with a tiny, incredibly intricate engraving. To the untrained eye, this is merely a vintage trinket, Lord Alastair explained to the silent, breathless room. But this locket bears the private seal of the Duke of Somerset. It was a custom christening gift. Clara, you were not abandoned. 24 years ago, your parents, Lord Thomas and Lady Catherine, were involved in a catastrophic car accident in upstate New York during a terrible blizzard. They perished in the crash. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. The room began to spin. They died? Yes, Beatrice said, her voice thick with emotion. You were in the vehicle. The nanny, severely concussed and panicking in the storm, managed to pull you from the wreckage. In her disoriented state, she wandered for miles until she reached a fire station. She left you there to go find an ambulance, but she succumbed to her injuries in the snow before she could tell anyone who you were. By the time the authorities found the wreckage days later, you were already lost in the anonymous bureaucracy of the American foster system. Eleanor Harrington looked as though she was going to faint. She gripped the microphone stand so hard, her knuckles turned white. The orphan she had just publicly humiliated for having no history was, in fact, royalty. The silence that followed Lord Alastair's devastating revelation was suffocating. 400 elite guests, people who built their entire identities on status, lineage, and exclusion, stood completely paralyzed. The social hierarchy of the room had just been violently inverted. The charity case bride, in the discounted dress, was now the highest-ranking aristocrat in the building. Your birth name, Lord Alastair continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, is Lady Clara Victoria Grosvenor Windsor. You are a direct descendant of the British aristocracy and the sole inheritor of the Somerset estate, which includes properties across Europe and a trust fund that has remained untouched for 24 years. Clara swayed on her feet. Nathaniel immediately caught her, his eyes wide with shock, but his grip steady and supportive. He looked from Clara to the princess, entirely ignoring his mother's frantic, desperate gestures from the stage. Are you telling me, Clara breathed, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, that I wasn't thrown away? My parents didn't leave me because they didn't want me. Oh, darling, no, Princess Beatrice said, reaching out to gently squeeze Clara's hands. You were the absolute light of their lives. Your mother, Lady Catherine, was my dear cousin. The moment we received the tip from the private investigator a week ago, cross-referencing your foster intake records with the exact date of the storm, we ran the DNA from a medical sample you provided to your employer. It was a flawless match. We have been moving heaven and earth to get here today. We wanted to bring you home. Suddenly, the scraping of a heavy wooden chair echoed loudly. Eleanor Harrington was practically sprinting down the stairs of the stage, her Dior suit suddenly looking far less imposing. Her face was flushed, stretched into a grotesque, panicked smile. The realization of what she had done, publicly insulting a member of the extended royal family, was sinking in. The social ramifications alone would ruin the Harrington name. Your Highness, Lady Clara, Eleanor gasped, shoving past Penelope Dubois, who was currently trying to shrink into the shadows. This is the most miraculous news. We are simply overjoyed. Clara, my sweetest girl, I always said you had a regal bearing. I always knew there was something exceptionally special about you. Nathaniel, isn't this wonderful? Our family is merged with the crown. Nathaniel looked at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Stop talking, Mother. Nathaniel, don't be silly, Eleanor pressed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. She reached out to touch Clara's arm, but Lord Alastair smoothly stepped in between them, blocking Eleanor's path with a stern, unimpressed look. Clara is a Harrington now. We are family. We must celebrate this extraordinary union. Clara stood up straighter. The years of feeling small, of apologizing for her existence, of politely absorbing the passive-aggressive cruelty of women like Eleanor and Chloe, evaporated. She felt the heavy, undeniable weight of her true history anchoring her. She was no longer a blank slate. She belonged to a legacy. We are not family, Eleanor, Clara said. Her voice was no longer a timid whisper. It was clear, sharp, and commanding. Eleanor froze, her fake smile trembling. Clara, dear, you're just overwhelmed. I am not overwhelmed. I am finally seeing clearly. Clara interrupted, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, locking eyes with Arthur Kensington and Chloe Harrington, who both quickly looked at the floor. 10 minutes ago, you stood on that stage and told 400 people that I was a pathetic, untethered nobody. You mocked my dress. You isolated my friends by the kitchen doors. You tried to break me so that I would spend the rest of my life bowing to you. I was merely... It was a misunderstanding, a joke, Eleanor stammered, sweating profusely under the unforgiving glare of Princess Beatrice and the silent condemnation of the ballroom. It wasn't a joke, Nathaniel said, stepping up beside his wife, his voice hardened with absolute finality. It was cruel. It has always been cruel. I am utterly ashamed of the way you have treated the woman I love. I thought you would change, but you only care about pedigrees and bank accounts. Nathaniel turned to Clara, his expression softening. I love you, Clara. Whether you are Clara Hayes or Lady Clara Grosvenor Windsor, I am with you. We don't need them. Clara looked at her husband, a genuine smile breaking through her tears. Then she looked back at Eleanor. Nathaniel and I are leaving, Clara announced to the silent room. But before we go, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. The Harrington family did not graciously take in an orphan. An orphan graciously tolerated a family of vipers, and she is done tolerating them. Clara turned to Princess Beatrice. Your Highness, you mentioned you had official business. Beatrice offered a brilliantly sharp, aristocratic smile. Indeed, Lord Alastair, the solicitor stepped forward, addressing the Harringtons. As Lady Clara's newly established legal counsel, I am instructed to inform you that the Crown and the Grosvenor estate will immediately be auditing the Harrington Foundation's recent joint ventures. We do not align our assets with families who exhibit such appalling public behavior. Good day to you. The threat was clear. The Harringtons would be financially and socially blacklisted by the most powerful people in Europe. Eleanor let out a choked, devastated sob, collapsing into a nearby chair as her husband buried his face in his hands. Chloe burst into tears, her socialite future evaporating before her eyes. Clara didn't look back. Hand in hand with Nathaniel, flanked by Princess Beatrice and the royal security detail, she walked out of the Pierre Hotel. She left behind a room full of humiliated elites and stepped into the crisp New York afternoon, no longer an outcast, but a queen of her own destiny, finally heading home. The crisp autumn air of Fifth Avenue hit Clara like a physical wave as she stepped out of the Pierre Hotel. For the first time in her life, she was not walking toward a subway station or hailing a yellow cab. She was being ushered into a convoy of armored Range Rovers with diplomatic plates. The transition from a humiliated, discounted bride to a heavily guarded aristocratic heiress happened in the blink of an eye. Paparazzi, tipped off by the sudden arrival of royal security minutes earlier, had already swarmed the sidewalks. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning, but the elite bodyguards formed a flawless human shield, guiding Clara and Nathaniel into the plush leather interior of the lead vehicle. Princess Beatrice slid into the seat opposite them, her posture relaxing just a fraction as the heavy, bulletproof doors slammed shut. The convoy immediately merged into the New York traffic, escorted by an NYPD motorcade that had miraculously materialized to clear their path toward Teterboro Airport. Inside the SUV, the silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the security detail's radios. Clara looked down at her hands. Her modest, off-the-rack wedding dress felt incredibly out of place against the opulent interior of the diplomatic vehicle. Nathaniel reached over, his warm hand enveloping hers, his thumb gently rubbing her knuckles. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low and laced with genuine concern. He hadn't let go of her since they walked out of the ballroom. "I don't know," Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I feel like I'm dreaming or hallucinating. A few hours ago I was terrified of sitting at table 42. Now, I don't even know what my name is." "You are Clara," Nathaniel said firmly. You are the woman I married. Nothing else matters to me." Princess Beatrice offered a warm, empathetic smile. "He is entirely right, my dear. The titles, the estates, the legacy, they are merely the setting of your life, not the substance of your character. Your parents, Thomas and Catherine, were the most grounded, fiercely compassionate people I knew. You have their eyes, Clara. And from what I witnessed in that ballroom, you clearly possess your mother's iron spine." Meanwhile, back at the Pierre Hotel, the situation had descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The Harringtons' attempt to maintain a facade of control shattered the moment a furious Arthur Kensington loudly demanded his wedding gift be returned. The socialites who had laughed at Eleanor's cruel toast were now frantically deleting their association with the Harrington family from their social media profiles. But the true disaster was brewing online. In the modern era of constant surveillance, high society events are never truly private. A disgruntled catering server who had witnessed the entire humiliating spectacle from the kitchen doors near table 42 had quietly recorded Eleanor's vicious toast and Princess Beatrice's subsequent dramatic entrance on their smartphone. Within 20 minutes of Clara's departure, the uncut video was uploaded to a major gossip blog. From there, it exploded. The internet, always ravenous for a story of arrogant billionaires getting their comeuppance, devoured the footage. The hashtag Harrington Vipers began trending globally on Twitter within the hour. By the time Clara's diplomatic convoy reached the tarmac at Teterboro Airport, where a sleek, custom Gulfstream G650 bearing the royal crest was waiting, the Harrington family was experiencing a digital execution. Eleanor Harrington sat in the bridal suite, clutching a highball glass of scotch, her face pale and drawn. The television in the corner was tuned to Bloomberg News. The anchor's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. A massive public relations catastrophe for Harrington real estate. Following a viral video exposing the family's shocking mistreatment of a bride who was just revealed to be a long-lost member of the British aristocracy, international investors are pulling out in droves. Shares of Harrington Enterprises have plummeted a staggering 18% in after-hours trading, and the Harrington Foundation has already been dropped by 3 major global charities. The Crown's legal team has reportedly severed all institutional ties. "Turn it off," Eleanor shrieked, throwing her glass at the wall. The crystal shattered, raining down on the plush carpet. Chloe was curled up on the sofa, sobbing hysterically as her phone vibrated with endless notifications of canceled brand deals and revoked country club memberships. Nathaniel's father, Richard Harrington, stood by the window, his face a mask of cold fury. "You just couldn't help yourself, could you, Eleanor?" he snarled. "You had to put the girl in her place. You had to show off. You have destroyed a 70-year-old company in 10 minutes. How was I supposed to know?" Eleanor screamed back, her perfect facade entirely dissolved into desperate panic. She was a nobody. She came from the system. "We have to fix this. We have to call Nathaniel. He is her husband. Legally, he has a right to her assets. We can use that leverage. We can force a public reconciliation." Richard looked at his wife with sheer disgust. "You really have learned absolutely nothing." High above the Atlantic Ocean, cruising at 40,000 feet, Clara was completely insulated from the media firestorm. The interior of the royal jet was a sanctuary of burled walnut, cream leather, and quiet efficiency. Lord Alistair had spent the last 2 hours walking Clara through her staggering inheritance. The documents laid out on the mahogany table detailed a life she couldn't comprehend. Historical estates in London, sprawling country manors in Somerset, and a vast trust fund that made the Harrington fortune look like a rounding error. But as Clara looked at a photograph of her biological parents, a handsome man with her exact smile, and a beautiful woman holding a tiny bundled baby, the money meant nothing. What mattered was the undeniable proof that she had been wanted. She traced the faces in the photograph, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. Nathaniel sat beside her, simply holding her in the quiet cabin, letting her mourn the 24 years that had been stolen from them. 2 days later, The rain was coming down in a gentle, persistent drizzle over the rolling green hills of Somerset, England. Clara stood in the grand foyer of Rosewood Manor, the ancestral seat of the Grosvenor-Windsor branch. The estate was a breathtaking marvel of 18th-century architecture, with sweeping staircases, priceless tapestries, and a dedicated staff who had lined up in the pouring rain to welcome their lost lady home. Walking through the massive, echoing halls, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman in her late 60s who had served Clara's parents, had wept openly upon seeing Clara. She had spent the morning showing Clara the nursery, perfectly preserved under dust covers, where Clara had spent the first few months of her life. But the tranquility of Rosewood Manor was abruptly interrupted by a ruthless attempt at survival from across the Atlantic. In a frantic bid to save her crumbling empire, Eleanor Harrington had hired the most vicious, high-priced divorce and corporate litigation attorneys in Manhattan. The Harrington real estate stock was in a terrifying freefall. Banks were calling in massive loans, citing the morality clauses that had been triggered by the global scandal. Desperate, Eleanor attempted to weaponize the very marriage she had spent months trying to destroy. As Clara, Nathaniel, Princess Beatrice, and Lord Alistair sat in the estate's magnificent library, a secure video call was connected to the Manhattan offices of Eleanor's legal team. On the massive screen, Eleanor looked haggard, her eyes bloodshot, flanked by three men in sharp, aggressive suits. "Let me be perfectly clear," the lead American attorney barked through the speakers, skipping any formal pleasantries. Nathaniel Harrington and Clara Hayes were legally married in the state of New York. There was no prenuptial agreement. Therefore, under the statutes of equitable distribution and marital property, Nathaniel is entitled to a significant portion of Clara's newly discovered assets. We are prepared to file an injunction freezing the Somerset Trust unless the Harrington family receives an immediate, stabilizing capital injection of $500 million to offset the damages caused by the Crown's public defamation. Nathaniel physically recoiled, looking at the screen as if a monster had just crawled out of it. "Mother," he whispered, his voice thick with horror. "You are trying to extort my wife to save your company?" "It's business, Nathaniel," Eleanor snapped defensively, trying to maintain her aristocratic superiority. "You belong to this family. You have a duty to protect our legacy. Clara's little inheritance can save us." Clara felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but before she could speak, Lord Alistair calmly adjusted his spectacles. He did not look angry. He looked exceptionally bored. "Are you quite finished, Counselor?" Lord Alistair asked, his crisp British accent cutting through the American lawyer's bluster. "We have the law on our side, Alistair," the lawyer sneered. "You have a fundamental misunderstanding of international law, aristocratic sovereignty, and common sense," Lord Alistair replied smoothly, opening his leather folio. "First, the Somerset Trust is protected by a royal charter established in 1742. It is strictly non-transferable and entirely immune to foreign civil litigation. The assets belong to the bloodline, not the spouse. Secondly, sovereign immunity dictates that you cannot file an injunction against the Crown's holdings in an American family court. A first-year law student could have told you that." Eleanor's face drained of its remaining color. "That can't be right. Nathaniel is her husband." "Furthermore," Lord Alistair continued, a dangerous glint in his eye, "we anticipated this precise, pathetic maneuver. Nathaniel, if you would be so kind." Nathaniel leaned forward, his face hard and uncompromising. "Before we left New York, I met with my own independent legal counsel. I have officially renounced my position on the board of Harrington Enterprises. I have signed over all my shares, trust funds, and future claims to the Harrington estate back to the company. I am entirely severing my financial and legal ties to you, Mother. You have nothing to claim from me because I no longer possess anything that belongs to you." "Nathaniel, no!" Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. You can't do that. You are the heir. I don't want to be the heir to a legacy built on cruelty and elitism, Nathaniel said firmly. I am building my own life with Clara. You are completely on your own. And finally, Mrs. Harrington, Clara spoke up. The library fell silent. Clara stepped closer to the camera, her chin held high, wearing a simple, elegant cashmere sweater that somehow looked far more regal than Eleanor's custom suits ever had. You tried to make me feel like I was nothing because I didn't have a name, but you forgot something very important. A name doesn't give you class. Money doesn't give you grace. You had all the wealth in the world, and you used it to be vicious. Now you have nothing. Clara reached out and pressed the button on the console, instantly severing the connection. The massive screen went black, plunging the Manhattan lawyers and a weeping Eleanor into absolute digital silence. Princess Beatrice let out a soft, approving chuckle, sipping her tea. Brilliantly handled, my dear. I do believe the vipers have officially been defanged. Clara turned to Nathaniel, who was looking at her with an expression of profound pride and unconditional love. The storm outside had broken, and a brilliant ray of afternoon sunlight pierced through the high library windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air and warming the ancient leather of the books. For the first time in 24 years, Clara didn't feel like a guest in someone else's world. She was exactly where she belonged. For the first few weeks, the transition into the highest echelons of British aristocracy felt like navigating a beautiful, elaborate labyrinth. Clara traded the harsh, noisy streets of New York for the serene, manicured gardens of Somerset. Her mornings were spent in the sun-drenched conservatory of Rosewood Manor, poring over centuries-old estate ledgers with Lord Alistair and learning the intricate protocols of royal engagements. Nathaniel, free from the suffocating expectations of his family's corrupt empire, found immense peace in the quiet English countryside. He began consulting for local historic preservation trusts, utilizing his architectural background in a way his father had always deemed entirely unprofitable and useless. Together, they were healing. But the silence of their countryside sanctuary was inevitably broken by the desperate, thrashing death throes of the Harrington Empire across the Atlantic. In Manhattan, the financial hemorrhage was catastrophic. Harrington Enterprises had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The board of directors had ousted Richard Harrington, and the family's sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse had been seized by creditors. The social exile was absolute. Eleanor and Chloe were blacklisted from every country club, charity gala, and Michelin-starred restaurant in the city. Penelope Dubois had publicly severed ties, claiming she was horrified by Eleanor's behavior, conveniently forgetting her own role in the cruelty at the Pierre Hotel. Stripped of her wealth and her social standing, Eleanor became dangerous. She possessed the venom of a cornered predator and a pathological inability to accept defeat. If she was going to drown, she was determined to drag Clara down into the murky depths with her. Operating from a rented, dimly lit apartment in Queens, a horrifying reality for a woman who once wore custom Dior. Eleanor contacted a notorious British tabloid publisher known for destroying reputations for profit. The publisher, a ruthless man named Simon Croft, specialized in fabricated scandals and sensationalized documentaries. Together, they concocted a vicious narrative. Eleanor was prepared to sign an exclusive $1 million contract for a televised tell-all interview titled "The Grifter Princess: How a Foster Child Fooled the Crown." The premise was a complete, malicious lie. Eleanor planned to claim that Clara had known about her lineage for years, had deliberately targeted Nathaniel for his wealth as a stepping stone, and had orchestrated the dramatic wedding interruption to publicly humiliate the Harringtons out of pure, sociopathic spite. The Crown's intelligence network, however, was light years ahead of a disgraced Manhattan socialite. Princess Beatrice arrived at Rosewood Manor on a Tuesday afternoon, her expression uncharacteristically grim as she stepped out of her chauffeured Bentley. She found Clara and Nathaniel in the library, enjoying tea. Without a word of preamble, Beatrice placed a heavily redacted intelligence file on the mahogany coffee table. "It appears your mother-in-law has decided that quiet obscurity does not suit her," Beatrice stated, settling into a velvet armchair. "Our press office intercepted communications between Eleanor and Simon Croft. They are planning to film a defamatory documentary next week. They intend to flood the media with fabricated documents painting you as a manipulative gold digger who emotionally abused the Harrington family." Nathaniel's jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. "She is relentless. Can't the Crown's legal team issue an immediate injunction, a gag order? We have enough leverage to bury Croft's publication entirely." "We can," Lord Alastair agreed, stepping into the room with his signature leather folio. "And we are prepared to file the paperwork within the hour. However, suppressing the story often breeds conspiracy. The tabloids will simply hint that the royal family is silencing a whistleblower. It leaves a lingering stain on Lady Clara's newly established reputation." Clara looked at the file, tracing the embossed royal seal on the cover. The old Clara, the frightened orphan who had hidden from confrontation at table 42, would have begged the lawyers to make it disappear. But that woman was gone. She was Lady Clara Grosvenor Windsor now, and she possessed an absolute, unbreakable clarity. "No injunctions," Clara said firmly, looking up. Nathaniel and Beatrice both turned to her in surprise. "If we silence her legally, she becomes a martyr to the gossip columns. She wants a public spectacle? We will give her one, but we will control the narrative entirely." "What do you propose, my dear?" Beatrice asked, a spark of intrigued admiration in her eyes. "I have spent my entire life having my story told for me by social workers, by indifferent foster parents, and by Eleanor Harrington," Clara explained, her voice steady and resolute. "It is time I tell it myself. I want to do a live primetime interview, not with a tabloid, but with a universally respected journalistic institution. I want to sit down with the BBC. I will address my past, my time in the foster system, the reality of my marriage to Nathaniel, and the truth about the Harrington family. We will preempt Eleanor's documentary with absolute, unassailable transparency." Lord Alastair smiled, a rare, genuine expression of pride. "A preemptive strike using the truth as an absolute weapon. It is brilliant. It strips Croft of his exclusive angle and renders Eleanor's claims as the desperate ramblings of a discredited woman." Within 48 hours, the machinery of the Royal Press Office was in full motion. The BBC's most respected senior correspondent, a veteran journalist named Julianne Morehouse, was discreetly invited to Rosewood Manor. There were no flashy tabloid promos, only a dignified press release announcing that Lady Clara Grosvenor Windsor would grant her first and only television interview to discuss her extraordinary life journey and announce her new philanthropic foundation. The night the broadcast aired, millions of viewers across the globe tuned in. Clara sat in the manor's drawing room, wearing a simple, elegant navy dress, radiating calm authority. She didn't attack Eleanor with venom. Instead, she used something far more destructive: pity. She detailed the horrific emotional abuse she endured on her wedding day. Not with anger, but with a profound sadness for a family so blinded by greed that they had lost their only son. When Clara brought out the cheap, faded wool blanket she was abandoned in, laying it gently next to the silver royal locket, the emotional impact was devastating. She spoke passionately about the flaws in the foster care system, pledging the bulk of her vast inheritance to reform it. By the time the hour-long interview concluded, the public response was unanimous. Clara was hailed as a global icon of grace and resilience. Simon Croft immediately canceled Eleanor's documentary contract, realizing the public would utterly destroy his publication if he dared attack the newly beloved princess. Eleanor's final, desperate gamble had not only failed, it had permanently cemented Clara's legacy while sealing her own absolute ruin. 6 months after the disastrous wedding in New York, the crisp London autumn gave way to a glittering winter season. The social calendar of the European elite was dominated by one unprecedented event: the inaugural gala for the Grosvenor Windsor Foundation, hosted by Lady Clara and Nathaniel at the historic Victoria and Albert Museum. It was to be Clara's first official, high-profile society debut, a formal introduction to the world, not as a traumatized bride, but as a reigning philanthropic force. The museum had been transformed into a breathtaking vision of winter elegance. The grand entrance was flanked by towering arrangements of white amaryllis and silver birch branches. The guest list was a staggering assembly of global power. Foreign dignitaries, Hollywood royalty, leading humanitarian figures, and prominent members of the British royal family. The press pen outside the museum was overflowing with hundreds of photographers, their camera flashes creating a continuous, blinding strobe light against the historic stone facade. When Clara's sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up to the red carpet, the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of applause. Nathaniel stepped out first, looking devastatingly handsome in a classic, bespoke Savile Row tuxedo. He turned and offered his hand to his wife. Clara emerged, and the collective breath of the press corps hitched. She wore a custom Alexander McQueen gown of deep, midnight blue velvet that draped flawlessly over her frame. The bodice was embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the light with every movement, but it was the jewelry that truly solidified her absolute dominion. Resting against her collarbone was the legendary Somerset sapphire, a massive, breathtaking gemstone surrounded by diamonds that had been in the royal vault for over 2 centuries. She looked entirely, unassailably majestic. As Clara and Nathaniel walked the red carpet, pausing to speak graciously with respected journalists and greeting the cheering crowds, the atmosphere was electric with admiration. Clara moved with a serene confidence, completely unfazed by the blinding flashes and shouting reporters. She was in her element, leveraging the intense public scrutiny to speak eloquently about the Foundation's mission to fund educational initiatives for aged-out foster youth. However, lurking in the frigid shadows just beyond the perimeter of the intense security detail, a ghost from the past was desperately trying to breach the gates. Eleanor Harrington was unrecognizable. The woman who had once dictated Manhattan high society was shivering in a cheap, off-the-rack trench coat. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was wind-blown and unkempt. The bankruptcy had stripped her of everything. Richard had officially filed for divorce, leaving her with massive legal debts. Chloe had fled to a remote yoga retreat in Central America to escape the paparazzi. Utterly destitute and delusionally desperate, Eleanor had spent the last of her drained credit lines on a coach ticket to London. She had convinced herself that if she could just confront Clara publicly, if she could fall to her knees and beg for forgiveness in front of the cameras, the public pressure would force Clara to offer her a financial settlement to make her go away. It was the desperate, twisted logic of a completely broken narcissist. As Clara and Nathaniel reached the top of the museum stairs, preparing to greet Princess Beatrice and the museum director, Eleanor saw her shrinking window of opportunity. She ducked beneath a velvet rope, shoving past a distracted photographer, and lunged toward the red carpet. "Clara! Nathaniel!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria, slicing through the elegant ambiance of the evening. "Please, you have to help me." The reaction of the elite royal security detail was instantaneous and terrifying. Within 2 seconds, 4 massive, highly trained officers intercepted Eleanor. They did not draw weapons, but they moved with a synchronized, brutal efficiency, forming a physical wall of muscle and dark suits between the disgraced socialite and the royal couple. They grabbed Eleanor by the arms, stopping her dead in her tracks just 10 feet away from Clara. The press pen erupted in chaotic frenzy. Cameras pivoted, lenses zooming in on the shocking disruption. Nathaniel stepped instinctively in front of Clara, his face darkening with a familiar, protective fury. "Get her out of here," he ordered the lead security officer, his voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. Now. Nathaniel, please, Eleanor sobbed, struggling pathetically against the guard's iron grip. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks, ruining her hastily applied makeup. I have nothing. The banks took everything. You cannot leave your own mother to rot in the streets. Clara, please, you have a foundation for charity now. Have mercy. The entire red carpet fell eerily silent, save for the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Everyone watched, holding their breath, waiting to see how the beloved Lady Clara would respond to the woman who had so brutally humiliated her on her wedding day. Clara gently placed a hand on Nathaniel's arm, silently asking him to step aside. She did not look angry. She did not look frightened as she gazed down at Eleanor, a woman who had once stood on a stage and mocked her for being an orphan. Clara's expression was one of profound, absolute indifference. It was the look one might give a discarded piece of trash on a beautiful sidewalk. My foundation, Clara said, her voice cool, carrying perfectly in the quiet night air, is dedicated to supporting innocent children who were abandoned by the world. It is not designed to fund the consequences of your cruelty, Eleanor. I made a mistake, Eleanor wailed, sinking to her knees on the cold pavement as the guards held her upright. I was trying to protect our family. You didn't have a family? Clara corrected her softly, adjusting the staggering weight of the Somerset sapphire at her neck. You had a corporation, and you bankrupted it. I sincerely suggest you learn to survive in the world you built for yourself. I had to. With a subtle, dismissive nod to the head of security, Clara turned her back entirely on Eleanor Harrington. The guards immediately hauled the sobbing, thrashing woman away, dragging her out of the spotlight and into the cold, unforgiving darkness of the London streets. The police waiting outside the perimeter swiftly arrested her for trespassing and causing a public disturbance. Clara linked her arm through Nathaniel's, offering a radiant, unbothered smile to Princess Beatrice, who was waiting at the grand entrance with an expression of deep satisfaction. The heavy oak doors of the Victoria and Albert Museum swung open, welcoming Lady Clara into a ballroom filled with warmth, respect, and unparalleled power. The orphan bride had not just survived the vipers, she had entirely rewritten the rules of the kingdom. 3 years had passed since the spectacular collapse of the Harrington real estate empire and Clara's dramatic integration into the British royal family. The relentless, biting winds of that terrible New York winter had long since given way to a bright, enduring spring in London. Clara's life had settled into a rhythm that was as profoundly impactful as it was beautifully serene. She had taken the immense, almost incomprehensible wealth of the Somerset Trust and transformed it into a weapon of mass compassion. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the streets surrounding Great Ormond Street Hospital were cordoned off by Metropolitan Police. Crowds of well-wishers, hospital staff, and international press had gathered behind the barricades. They were there to witness the grand opening of the Catherine Grosvenor Windsor Wing, a state-of-the-art pediatric oncology and family support center, fully funded by Clara's foundation. Clara stood in the hospital's new atrium, a space that felt nothing like a clinical institution. The room was flooded with natural sunlight pouring through massive skylights. The walls were painted in soothing, warm tones, and living green walls of ivy and ferns stretched toward the ceiling, bringing the healing calm of nature indoors. It was an architectural masterpiece designed entirely by Nathaniel. After severing ties with his family's corrupt, profit-obsessed corporation, Nathaniel had launched his own independent firm in Mayfair. He dedicated his career to designing sustainable, community-focused spaces that prioritized human well-being over corporate greed. The hospital wing was his love letter to Clara, a physical manifestation of her lifelong dedication to vulnerable children. "It is absolutely breathtaking, darling," Princess Beatrice murmured, walking beside Clara as they toured the facility before the official press conference. Beatrice wore a chic, understated navy suit, her presence a constant, supportive anchor in Clara's life. "Your mother would have been so incredibly proud," You have taken a tragedy and built a sanctuary." Clara smiled, gently bouncing her 6-month-old daughter, Lady Lily Catherine, on her hip. The baby, swaddled in a soft cashmere blanket, possessed Nathaniel's dark curls and Clara's bright, observant eyes. "It feels right," Clara said softly, looking around at the dedicated playrooms and the private apartment-style suites, designed so parents could live alongside their children during long treatments. "When I was working in the system back in New York, I saw how families were torn apart simply because they couldn't afford to stay close. No family should have to choose between their livelihood and their sick child. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, the consequences of relentless cruelty had settled into a bleak, inescapable reality. In a dingy, fluorescent-lit diner on the outskirts of Atlantic City, Eleanor Harrington wiped a damp rag across a sticky formica table. The custom Dior suits were gone, replaced by a stiff, polyester uniform that smelled permanently of stale coffee and fryer grease. The Harrington bankruptcy had been absolute. Stripped of all assets, legally barred from the corporate world, and completely abandoned by her former high society friends, Eleanor was forced to survive in the working-class reality she had spent her entire life mocking. Her hands, once adorned with blinding Cartier diamonds, were now dry and cracked from cheap dish soap. Her daughter Chloe had maxed out her final credit cards and married an aspiring, debt-ridden cryptocurrency scammer just to keep a roof over her head in a cramped Florida apartment. They did not speak to each other. Above the diner's counter, a small, static-filled television was tuned to a morning news broadcast. Eleanor paused, her rag freezing on the tabletop, as the anchor's voice cut through the clatter of silverware. A monumental day for pediatric healthcare in London, as Lady Clara Grosvenor Windsor officially cuts the ribbon on a groundbreaking new facility. Joined by her husband, renowned architect Nathaniel Harrington, and members of the royal family, the beloved philanthropist continues to redefine modern aristocratic duty. The screen flashed to a live feed of Clara. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly at peace, standing next to a proud Nathaniel and holding their beautiful child. The crowd in the broadcast was cheering, a stark contrast to the absolute silence of Eleanor's miserable existence. "Hey, lady," a rough voice barked from a nearby booth, snapping Eleanor out of her trance. A disgruntled truck driver pointed to his empty mug. "You gonna wipe that table, or are you gonna get me some more coffee?" Eleanor swallowed the bitter, acidic lump of regret in her throat. She looked down at her stained uniform, then back at the television screen. The orphan she had tried to destroy had become royalty, while she had become a ghost. "Coming," Eleanor mumbled, shuffling back toward the kitchen, completely irrelevant to the world. Back in London, the grand atrium of the new hospital wing was buzzing with anticipation. Lord Alastair, looking as distinguished as ever, stepped up to the wooden podium, tapping the microphone to silence the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lord Alastair began, his crisp voice echoing through the beautiful space. "For centuries, the concept of nobility has been defined by bloodlines, estates, and titles. But true nobility is not inherited. It is demonstrated. It is measured by what one does for those who have nothing. It is my profound honor to introduce a woman who embodies the very best of our history and the brightest hope for our future, Lady Clara Grosvenor Windsor." The applause was deafening as Clara handed baby Lily to Nathaniel, who kissed his wife's cheek before she stepped up to the podium. Clara looked out at the sea of faces, doctors, nurses, social workers, and families who would benefit from this center. She didn't see an intimidating crowd of vipers waiting to judge her. She saw a community waiting to be healed. "When I was very young, I was told that I had no history." Clara spoke into the microphone, her voice steady, warm, and resonating with undeniable authority. "I was told that without a name, I had no place in the world. But I have learned that a legacy is not simply something you are handed. It is something you build. We built this center not just to heal bodies, but to protect families, because no one, no matter where they come from, should ever have to fight the darkness alone. Clara smiled, looking directly at Nathaniel and her daughter. The flashes of the press cameras illuminated the room, capturing the absolute triumph of a woman who had walked through the fires of humiliation and emerged as a queen of her own destiny. The orphan bride was gone. In her place stood a matriarch, fiercely protective, endlessly compassionate, and finally, truly at home. The truth about Clara's lineage shook the highest echelons of society to its core, proving that true class isn't bought with old money. It's in your blood and your actions. Eleanor's tragic downfall from a billionaire socialite to a diner waitress is the ultimate proof that karma never misses an address. What did you think of Eleanor's instant karma? Have you ever witnessed snobs getting exactly what they deserve in real life? Drop your stories in the comments below. If you loved this jaw-dropping tale of elite revenge and royal secrets, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life drama.